Hello YouTube. I want to do a quick video on my feelings on political activism because I think it's an important conversation. I think it's an interesting conversation. How you think through what political activism is I think extremely interesting and important. And I think there are lots of ideological problems with how we tend to think through the subject of political activism. Now, first of all, some people have come to the conclusion, based on my previous videos, that I'm against political activism as a totality. This is false. Obviously, it's false. First point I want to make, though, first point of what I would consider the ideological aspect of activism. The first thing that I think is problematic is this notion that that what we need is lots of people. You know, what's needed to spread ideas to all over the world, right? You need lots of people to be ideologically on the same page, and that's how we affect political change. I don't think that this has any historical basis. There are contexts where in which a whole lot of people on the same ideological page is what you need. You can think of the Million Man March, for instance. You can think of a few different examples. On the other hand, there are contexts where the most dramatic political changes have been instigated by not a lot of people, but a few people. And there are contexts where in which instigating political change only requires a few people on the same ideological page to mediate between lots of disparate groups with lots of disparate interests who aren't on the same ideological page. One example of the former would be the October Revolution. That really was like a few people who were able to seize hold of the government in Russia and set up what would later become the Soviet Union. Now, without commenting on the goodness or badness of the Soviet Union, particularly in those early years, because I think that you could have a conversation about, 1917 through 1919, that period in Soviet history, and whether or not they were being good guys or bad guys. I think that things are much more complex than that, and much more interesting than that, actually. But the fact of the matter is that a radical break was instigated by not a lot of people. Another example would be the American Revolution, where in which you did have a lot of people, but you had a lot of people who weren't on the same ideological page. I mean, the sort of political genius of the founding fathers is that there was lots of political unrest within the colonies. The founding fathers, and those, by the way, those political struggles were not in line with one another. They weren't struggling for the same thing. They probably weren't aware of each other. They weren't in any way cohesive. What the founding fathers were able to do is to construct and propagate a narrative that said, "Fight for us," right? Fight the British. Your grievances are tied to British rule, right? They were able to go to these different places and say, fight for us and your grievances will be alleviated, right? You have this organization of people who are getting together and being activists and doing all of this for, let's say the Levelers or something like that. Groups of people who really didn't care about the British. The founding fathers were able to sell them a narrative that showed them or tried to demonstrate to them that the British were their enemies. I don't think that's a controversial point. So the point being is that the people who were on the same ideological page we tend to refer to as the founding fathers. The people who actually did the legwork in the revolution weren't necessarily on the same ideological page as the founding fathers, But the Founding Fathers had, you could make an argument that it was quite cynical, actually. Not saying it's bad or good, right? But they had talked them into the idea that your grievances that you're struggling for already will be alleviated if we fight the English. So instead of getting everybody on the same ideological page, the goal was to mediate between different ideologies that were happening at the time to constitute a force. Those are two examples where you see that a radical break in history, a radical revolutionary break in history, a radical political shift, didn't really come from, a large mass of people who were on the same page. Again, there are contexts in which that's good. There are contexts in which that's just not what you need. So that's important to remember. I think that we on the left have been bewitched by the idea of a certain scale of protest, right? Lots and lots of people equals good. Why? So this is where I want to throw in my first positive statement, right? That is that proper activism is entirely contingent on the concrete situation. Proper activism cannot be thought apart from the realpolitik of the issue that you're protesting. Strategies have to be developed based on the actual moment. So when you just assume that when you assume something a priori, like a whole bunch of people on the same ideological page, you're already in a huge problem, right? Because you're making an a priori judgment about a concrete situation. It's not the way to do anything, right? No, the concrete situation has to come first. So when you say something like, social media can affect political change, well, okay, social media can affect political change. Is social media the right tool for all situations? No. What determines what the right tools are is the reality of the matter, not some a priori nexus of ideas. Second point I would try to make is that there are different ways of parsing the problems that we face in the world. So you can point to, corporate control of capital. You can point to labor exploitation in, Southeast Asia. You can point to all sorts of really, really big problems that affect lots and lots of people, right? And I think that a certain kind of naive activism would say we need to protest that activity. Take the example of, Foxconn. We need to protest that activity. Well, I mean, the spirit behind that is noble, sure, but we have to ask the question, how much is Foxconn actually a single issue that exists in a vacuum that needs to be processed in and of itself? It seems to me that things like Foxconn are going to exist. I mean, exploiting really, really, really cheap labor in terrible working conditions. That exploitation will always take place so long as we have global neoliberal capitalism. So is Foxconn really the problem? Does it make sense to really protest against Foxconn? I mean, Foxconn seems to me to be something like the output of a global economic structure. If you protest against Foxconn, even if you got Foxconn closed down, would that necessarily be a good thing? It would be good, but it would be like treating a symptom, wouldn't it? It's not getting at the heart of the problem. So there's a question then, how do you get at the heart of the problem? And the answer to that is really, really, really difficult. The fact is, we're talking about extremely complex issues. How do we fix the underlying brokenness of the system in which we live? And in order to answer that question, We have to start by understanding that maybe we can't. This is an important realization, I think, just existentially. I would argue that I think a left that conceives of themselves as impotent, a left that conceives of themselves as having no place to properly put their moral outrage, is a much more dangerous left than a left that that engages in these naive activist activities. And I mean that quite sincerely. Situations wherein which people don't feel like they can speak, which I think is the reality of the matter. I mean, sure, you can speak, but to assume that that speech is getting something done pacifies moral outrage. It gives you the belief that you can do something, that you can, if you just work hard enough, you can make a change in the world, blah, blah, blah. And it sucks you into this nexus of meaningless activities, I would say. I'd say that belief is dangerous. On the other hand, if you have a whole bunches of people who morally object to it, and they feel like they can't get something done, situations like that tend to explode. That produces a much more volatile political situation. Moral outrage is a source of energy, right? It's a source of revolutionary potential in a certain way. And if you successfully get rid of all of the sort of accepted and sort of safe channels by which to express that activity, then you have to create new channels, right? You have to produce something new. There's no way otherwise to survive. And that, for me, has a much more destabilizing potential. So when you bring up traditions of pamphleteering, for instance, you can bring up examples where pamphleteering did things, right? As in the case of Thomas Paine, right? You can also bring in cases where pamphleteering did nothing. I imagine all the Marxists on college campuses in 1968, passing out pamphlets about how capitalism is evil, and here we are, still within this space, within this system. That's important. Something that's extremely important, though, about the question of Foxconn versus, what's the problem? Is it Foxconn or is it the structure of global neoliberal capitalism? Is that you have then two levels of moral objection, I think. You have objection to the particular, and you have an objection to the structure of the universal, right? Foxconn being the particular, the structure of the universal being the universal. So, because you have two sets of goals, right, I think that it's immediately naive to suppose that those two sets of goals are going to be in line. What if fixing the Foxconn problem strengthens global neoliberal capitalism? I'll just refer to that as capitalism from here on out. What if fixing the Foxconn problem strengthens capitalism? That's a really serious question. I mean, if you've come to the conclusion that capitalism is the problem, Foxconn is a symptom, then protesting Foxconn and having that problem resolved, if that strengthens capitalism, well, then you have a really big fucking problem on your hands, and you have a really hard moral question. You have one of these bizarre utilitarian situations. Is it right, in that case, to fix the Foxconn problem? I would say yes, but on the other hand, it's not. Point being is that we live in a complex world. Think about the New Deal. The New Deal is a great example. Organized labor won a lot of battles in the 1930s through the New Deal. In the United States, organized labor hasn't won a major legal victory since then. And in fact, the things that organized labor won are being sort of stripped away, have been stripped away for the past 70 or 80 years. Not totally, right? But organized labor was in a better position in the 1940s than they were, or than they are now, legally speaking. Did the New Deal help labor? Yes. But was the problem with labor the fact that a capitalist economy didn't have enough protections against labor, or protections for labor? If you affirm that proposition, then the New Deal was great. If you reject that proposition as being naive, right? If you take a Marxian line and say, no, the problem with labor is the structure of capitalism as such, and all of these issues were symptoms, right? Then the New Deal just pushed off the issue, right? The New Deal was a way of pacifying laborers, so that they couldn't get it, so that they didn't have the manpower and energy to get to the heart of the problem. It's a question. It's a hard question. I don't know the answer to it. So you have this aporia at work between the individual and the universal. The individual being, or the particular, let's say, and the universal. The particular being some labor struggle. The universal being the source of exploitation. In some sense, I've been trying to argue for a very pragmatic approach. I've been arguing that the concrete situation ought to determine the particular tactics that we use, right? I've been trying to point out that various interests, long-term interests may come into conflict with short-term interests, and all of this, and I very, very much insist that the way to get at those kinds of questions is not through activism, it's through thought, which can form the basis for an effective activism. But activism always needs to be preceded by thought, I think. You can't just have mindless organizing that borrow tactics from this worked once, so we're going to do this to all political situations, right? That I don't buy. But there's another problem. If you take two examples of thinkers who have made very compelling cases. I mean, they're mutually exclusive cases. But I'm just trying to point to you that there may be bigger problems at work. First, let's take Foucault, first of all, right? Foucault is very skeptical about activism. One of the things that we learn from Foucault is that political activities and political engagement, whatever that kind of engagement might be, are predicated on certain assumptions about how power functions. For instance, if you were to say, impeach Obama, then you would assume that power in its negative form, or its bad form, let's say, emanates from Obama, right? And then if you remove Obama, then you remove, this form of power, a bad manifestation of power, right? The trouble is, within a capitalist framework, that doesn't make sense. The reason why is that it's not particular individuals. Responsibility and power is diffused to such a degree that you can't point to one person and say, this is the guy that we need to get rid of. You can't even point to a group of people and say, these are the people that we need to get rid of. It doesn't quite work that way. But to take that line assumes certain things about how power actually operates in the world. You can't undertake any form of political activity without that political activity assuming a model of the structure of power. So we need to begin by understanding how power actually operates. He suggests that the way power is set up, it's built to be able, or to be actually strengthened by challenges to it, right? And I think that this is extremely true, right? I think that that the great strength of capitalism has been its ability to appropriate its own contradictions back into itself and turn them into strengths. I mean, you think about probably the last solid challenge to the system as such was in the '68 student movements. But you can take all of those revolutionary figures. Take Che Guevara. I can go to Hot Topic and buy a Che Guevara T-shirt, right? Che Guevara becomes a brand to buy and sell in the market. This is an example of capitalism reappropriating a challenge to it. Another even more compelling example would be something like the Iraq War protests. The Iraq War protests were extremely fascinating because, on the one hand, they were an attempt to challenge the functionings of power. However, those protests were recast as being a great virtue of the system wherein which we live. That is to say, isn't it so nice that we live in a world where you can protest power, right? So the moral objection to the system as such becomes recast as the great virtue of the system as such. This is a humongous problem. You can think of punk rock and counterculture movements. Movements of basically kids saying, no, like, this is terrible, we can't take this anymore, etc. All of that can just get sucked back up into the system and sold back to them. Dissidence becomes part of the structure of capitalism itself. And in that situation, how do you be an activist? What actions can you possibly undertake that aren't reappropriated and don't just get sucked back up into the system that you're protesting against? I think that's an extremely difficult question. I think it's a huge fucking roadblock. I don't have an answer, and I think anybody who does have, or who does claim to have an answer, is probably stupid. That's a problem that needs to be thought about, right? So if you want to really be an activist, I mean, the number one project probably should be trying to think of forms of activism that can't just be sucked back into the system and sold back to you. I think that's an extremely hard problem.